My wife thought my $10 million was her personal bank for her young lover. She didn't know I was checking the books for months while she planned our Valentine's dinner in Manhattan. The leather in my office chair creaked like a warning as I sat in the shadows of my Manhattan penthouse. Outside, the New York wind was screaming against the floor-to-ceiling glass, but inside, the silence was sharp enough to cut. I looked at the Patek Philippe on my wrist. The gold was cold against my skin. It was 7:45 p.m. on February 14, 2026. The world called it Valentine's Day. I called it the day of the final reckoning. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 58 years old. For 32 years, I've been the man people call when the numbers don't add up. I've spent my life in the gray light of spreadsheets and bank statements, hunting for the small lies that hide big crimes. I am a man of precision, but I never thought my greatest investigation would be into the woman sleeping in my own bed. Claire, my wife, was in the kitchen. She was preparing dessert. That's what she told the 20 guests waiting in our dining room. My mother, my sisters, our 2 grown children, and our oldest friends. I had spent $3,500 on the food and wine alone. I wanted everything to be perfect because I wanted the audience to be large when the mask finally fell. I stood up and walked down the hallway. I didn't make a sound on the Italian marble. I stopped 2 meters from the kitchen door. It was slightly open. I smelled her expensive perfume, the one I'd never seen before, the one that smelled like a younger woman's choices. And then I heard it, the whisper. It wasn't the voice of a music teacher from a private school. It was the low, intimate heat of a woman in love. "Happy Valentine's Day, baby," she murmured. There was a pause. I could hear her shy, fake laugh, the one she used to give me 20 years ago. Yes, the old man is right there. He's hosting the whole family, 20 people just like always. He has no idea. My heart didn't race. My money brain took over. I stood in the dark, breathing in the scent of pine and expensive gin, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. "I'll see you at midnight. He'll be asleep after all that wine. I've got the $5,000 in cash. I love you, Rodrigo. You're the only real thing in my life." I took out my phone. My fingers were steady as I hit the record button. I stood there for 3 minutes, capturing every word of her betrayal, every plan to use my money to fund a life with a man who wasn't worth the leather in my shoes. When she hung up, I heard the sound of a kiss. She was kissing the screen of her phone. I stepped into the kitchen. The light was bright, clinical. Claire was putting a store-bought cake onto a silver tray, a $45 cake she told everyone she spent all day baking. She was wearing a red silk dress that cost me $620 last month. It looked like a bloodstain against the white counter.
"The guests are waiting, Claire," I said. My voice was as dry as old parchment. She jumped, her hand flying to her throat to hide the jewelry I'd bought her for our 20th anniversary, the jewelry she told me she lost months ago. "Arthur, you scared me. I was just checking the recipe for the icing." "On a cake that came in a box from the bakery on 5th Avenue?" I asked, stepping closer. I could see the panic behind their eyes, the quick flicker of a lie being born. "I wanted to add a personal touch," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "For the family, for us." "Liar," I said. The word was small, but it filled the room. She blinked. "What? Arthur, you've had too much wine." "I've had exactly enough," I interrupted. I held up my phone. "I was checking the books, Claire, not the bank accounts, not yet. I was checking your voice. Merry Christmas, love. You're my real family. That's what you just said." "You was spying on me?" She tried to look angry. The scheming wife always tries to turn the guilt around. "I was collecting evidence," I corrected. I walked to the counter and picked up the cake. 20 people are waiting for dessert. They've been eating my food and drinking my wine for 3 hours. They deserve to hear what you just said. "Arthur, stop. We can talk about this in the bedroom. Please, think about the children." I am thinking about him, I said, looking her straight in the eyes. I'm thinking about the $32,000 our daughter needs for her medical specialization in Zurich, the money that seems to have disappeared into your miscellaneous expenses over the last 9 months. The color drained from her face. She looked 100 years old in that $600 dress. I can explain that. I can explain it to everyone, I said. I turned and walked toward the dining room. I could hear her heels clicking behind me, fast and desperate. I could hear her breath hitching. I walked into the dining room. The warmth of the fire, the smell of roasting meat, and the sound of 20 people laughing hit me like a wall. My mother was at the end of the table, smiling. My son, the lawyer, was pouring more wine. My daughter, the future surgeon, was laughing at a joke. I put the cake down in the center of the table. The silence started at my end and moved down like a wave until the room was tomb quiet. "Before we eat," I said, my voice projecting to every corner of the room, "I have a special Valentine's Day gift for my wife." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't look at Claire. I didn't need to see her face to know she was crumbling. I connected the phone to the Bluetooth speaker, the one we've been using for jazz all night. "Arthur, don't," she whispered from the doorway. She was pale, shaken, a ghost in a red dress. "This isn't a gift you can return," I said to the room. "This is the truth." I pressed play. The speaker crackled, and then Claire's voice filled the penthouse. "Happy Valentine's Day, baby. Yes, the old man is right there. You're my real family. I love you, Rodrigo." I watched my son's face turn to stone. I watched my daughter cover her mouth. I watched my mother's eyes fill with a horror that I knew would never leave them. Claire stood in the doorway, her world melting under the heat of her own words. She had traded 31 years of loyalty for a musician in a cheap apartment. I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of the lie. I felt the power of the truth. "The locks are being changed tomorrow, Claire," I said into the silence. "The accounts are already frozen. Your real family is waiting for you in a 1-bedroom in Harlem. I suggest you go find them." The sound of Claire's heels hitting the floor as she ran toward the elevator was the only music I needed. I stood at the head of the table, the silence of 20 people weighing more than the gold on my wrist. I didn't look at my children yet. I looked at my sister, Amparo, whose face was a mask of pure New York rage. I sat back down, the cold wood of the chair feeling solid, and I pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from under the table. The paper was rough against my fingertips, a physical record of every lie told in this house. "Eat," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a cold blade. "The food is paid for. $3,500 of my money is sitting on those plates. Don't let it go to waste just because the woman who served it is a thief." I opened the envelope. These weren't just sheets of wood pulp. They were the hard evidence of 31 years of a lie. I started checking the books in front of everyone. I didn't call it an audit. I called it the final settlement. "Nuria," I said, looking at my daughter. Her eyes were red, a hand shaking so hard she dropped her fork. The silver hit the china with a sharp ring. "You wanted to go to Zurich for cardiac surgery. $32,000 for the year. That was the dream I was supposed to fund, right?" She nodded, a single sob escaping her throat. "I went through the joint account 3 days ago," I continued, sliding the yellow-marked bank statement across the white linen tablecloth. I wanted her to see the numbers. "In June, while you were applying for that scholarship, Claire moved $5,000 to a musician's account in Harlem. In July, another $4,000. In August, she sold the pearl necklace I gave her for our 20-year anniversary, $3,200 in cash. Gone." I could smell the metallic tang of the silver and the heavy, sweet scent of the roses. It smelled like a funeral for a life I thought I had. "I checked every cent," I said, my voice low and steady. "I found receipts for a 1-bedroom apartment on 125th Street, $2,200 a month. Claire's name is on the lease. She's been paying for his bed while she slept in mine. Total theft from this family, $27,460 in 9 months.
The dining room exploded. My sister Amparo stood up, a chair screeching against the marble. "She used your money to pay for that loser's rent?" she shouted, "while my brother works 60 hours a week in the city?" I didn't answer her. I was watching my son, Marcus. He was 29, a lawyer who prided himself on his logic. He wasn't looking at the papers. He was looking at his shoes, his face pale and covered in sweat.
"Marcus," I said. The word was heavy. "You're a man of the law. You see these dates? February 2024, March 2024, April 2024. He didn't look up. "I found something else when I was checking the books," I said, leaning forward. The smell of his fear was stronger than the food. "I found old emails from 2018 to an account I didn't recognize, but the sender was Claire, and the recipient was you." I pulled out a second stack of papers. These felt heavier. They felt like lead. "It wasn't just Rodrigo, was it, Marcus?" I asked. "There was a man named Ricardo back in 2018, a gym teacher, and you've known for 8 years that your mother was a snake, and you didn't say a word that a man who paid for your law school." The room went tomb quiet again. Nuria looked at her brother in horror. My mother looked like she was about to collapse. Marcus finally looked up. His eyes were full of fear, but also a strange, ugly defiance. "I was protecting the family, Dad," he whispered. I felt the cold bite of the bourbon as I took a slow sip. "No," I said, "you were protecting your inheritance. You knew if I found out, the money would stop flowing. You didn't love me. You just loved my checkbook." I stood up, the weight of the whole room on my shoulders. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 sets of keys. I threw them on the table. They hit the silver with a loud, final clatter. "You want to protect the family, Marcus?" I asked. "Then go protect your mother. You're both out. And you, Nuria, I have one more paper for you to read." I handed her a small, white envelope. My heart was a stone in my chest. "Open it," I commanded.
Nuria's fingers were trembling so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. She pulled out the single sheet of paper, and I watched her face turn from a soft pink to a ghostly, clinical white. The envelope in her hands was heavy, weighted down by the truth I had uncovered during my final reckoning. I didn't use a lawyer for this part. I did the verification myself, late at night, smelling the musty scent of old bank ledgers and digital prints. It was the smell of rot hidden under expensive perfume. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass on a stone floor. "You canceled the wire transfer? All of it?" "I didn't cancel your future, Nuria," I said, leaning forward until I could see the reflection of my own cold eyes in hers. "Your mother spent it. She spent it on hotel rooms in Midtown and a lifestyle for a man who doesn't even own a tie. And you were the one checking the books with her. I found the second ledger, the one you thought was hidden in the Hamptons house." I picked up my bourbon, the crystal glass heavy and solid in my palm. The amber liquid was the only warm thing in the room. I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle. "I spent 30 years building a name you thought you could drag through the mud," I said, each word hitting the table like a lead weight. I reached into the folder and pulled out a photo. It wasn't Claire and her lover. It was Nuria, 2 months ago, at a high-end jewelry store on Madison Avenue. She was selling her grandmother's gold watch, the one I told her to keep for her own daughter one day. $32,000, I said, the number cutting through the air. "That was your price for silence. You found out about Marcus and the gym teacher back in 2018. You didn't tell me because Claire promised you a cut of the extra family funds. You weren't protecting me, Nuria. You were a business partner and a fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, sounding like a countdown to their social liquidation. My daughter looked at the paper, a total freeze of a trust fund and a notice of a civil lawsuit for the recovery of stolen property. "Marcus, don't just sit there," Nuria sobbed, turning to her brother.
Do something. You're a lawyer. Marcus didn't move. He looked at the silver key I had taken from the floor, the key to the safe he thought I hadn't checked yet. He realized then that the trap was total. His law license, his reputation, his inheritance, it was all dissolving in the New York night. "This house is no longer a shelter for traitors," I said, standing up. I felt a strange, cold peace. The final settlement is done. Your names have been removed from the building's security list. Your cars are being towed as we speak. You chose your side years ago when you chose the lie. Now go see if Claire's lover has a spare room for you both. As they stood up, broken and silent, I reached for the phone on the table. There was one more person I needed to call, and the sound of the dialing tones felt like the closing of a tomb. The penthouse was built on 30 years of my blood, but tonight I realized the foundations were hollow, rotted through by the very people I called my blood. I sat there, smelling the expensive lilies and the salt of my daughter's tears, and I felt nothing but the urge to burn the bridge behind me. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the cold, flickering heart of New York City. The lights of Manhattan looked like millions of eyes watching my failure, but I wasn't failing. I was cleaning house. Behind me, the dining room felt like a crime scene. Marcus was slumped in his chair, his expensive wool suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking spirit. Noria was a wreck of silk and smeared mascara, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that sounded like a dying engine. I turned back to him, my hand resting on the heavy, cold crystal of the bourbon decanter. The weight of it felt good, solid, real. Everything else in this room was a hallucination. I thought about every hour I spent in the office while they were toddlers, every flight I took to London or Tokyo to secure the wealth they used like water. I built this empire brick by brick, and all the while these rats were gnawing at the base, laughing while they ate. I spent 40 years building a name you thought you could drag through the mud. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcus tried to speak, his throat working hard, the sound of his swallow audible in the tomb-like silence. "Dad, we thought we were helping you stay happy. You loved her. We didn't want to be the ones to kill that." "You didn't want to kill the host," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. I walked toward him, the scent of his sweat hitting me, sour and sharp under the smell of his $500 cologne. It was the smell of a trapped animal. "You wanted the dinners, the Hamptons, the prestige. You knew that if I cut Claire out, the party was over. You didn't protect my heart, Marcus. You protected your lifestyle."
I reached out and grabbed his arm. His skin was cold. I didn't shake him. I just held him until he looked me in the eyes. I saw the weakness there, the same hollow greed I saw in Claire's eyes before she fled. I let go of him with a shove that sent him back into his chair. The silence you're hearing is the sound of every door in this town closing on you. I looked over at the sideboard where my house manager, Miller, was standing like a statue. He had been with me for 15 years. He had seen these children grow up. He had served them 1,000 meals. "Miller," I said, not taking my eyes off my son. "Yes, Mr. Vance? The keys on the table. Take 'em. The codes for the service elevator, the main entrance, and the garage are to be reset in 5 minutes. If either of these individuals attempts to enter the building again, you are to notify security and have them removed for trespassing. No exceptions, not even for my mother." Miller's face was a blank mask. "Understood, sir." Noria let out a wail, a high-pitched, thin sound that made my teeth ache. "Miller, please, you know us. You can't just—" Miller didn't even look at her. He didn't blink. He simply stepped forward, picked up the keys with a gloved hand, and vanished into the shadows of the kitchen.
That was the first stage of the social death, to be invisible in your own home, to be a ghost before you're even dead. I walked to the table and picked up my phone. I dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. It wasn't the police, it was the membership director of the Hudson Club, the most exclusive circle in the city, where Marcus spent his Friday nights trying to look like a man of consequence.
Arthur Vance calling, I said, my eyes locked on Marcus's face. I saw his pupils dilate. He knew. I'm calling to withdraw my sponsorship for Marcus Vance, effective immediately. His corporate account is to be closed and his access revoked. Yes, thank you. I hung up. Marcus looked like I had punched him in the gut. His status was his life. Without that club, without my name, he was just another lawyer in a city full of them, struggling to pay rent in a borough he used to make fun of. This isn't a negotiation, it's a cleanup. Noria was on her knees now, the red roses from the centerpiece scattered around her like a funeral shroud. The smell of the crushed petals was overwhelming, sweet and rotting. Dad, I have nothing. I can't even pay my rent next month. I don't have a job yet. You're killing me. Your mother has a one-bedroom in Harlem, I said, picking up my glass. Maybe she can teach you how to sell jewelry for cash. You were so good at it with your grandmother's watch. I felt the surge of cold energy. For years I had been the provider, the rock, the man who solved every problem with a check and a smile. I had been a prisoner of my own generosity. Tonight I was free. I looked at the table, the half-eaten steak, the silver, the crystal. It all looked like trash now. Go, I said, before I decide to call the firm where Marcus works and tell his senior partners about the $50,000 he borrowed from the family trust 2 years ago. Marcus froze. He hadn't known I found that. His breath stopped. The silence in the room became so heavy I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. You knew? Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. I checked the books, Marcus. It's what I do. I've known for 18 months. I was waiting to see if you'd ever tell me the truth. You chose the lie. Now you pay the price. I watched them stand up, their movements slow and heavy, like they were walking through deep water. They looked at the guests, my sisters, my friends, expecting someone to speak up, to beg for mercy. But there was nothing. My sister Amparo turned her head away. My mother just stared at the floor, her hands twisting her pearl necklace until I thought it would snap. They walked toward the door. No one helped them with their coats. No one said goodbye. The penthouse felt larger, cleaner as they moved toward the exit. I followed them to the foyer, watching them as they stepped into the hallway. Just as the elevator doors began to slide shut, I stepped forward. Wait, I said. Marcus looked up with a spark of hope in his eyes, a disgusting, desperate hope. I found a third ledger, Marcus, I said, my voice a whisper that carried like a gunshot. One that Claire didn't even know about, the one with your name on it and a signature from a man I thought was my best friend. Marcus's face went from pale to a terrifying shade of gray. The elevator doors closed, cutting off his scream of protest. I turned back to the room, but I wasn't looking at my family. I was looking at Felix, my best friend for 35 years, who was sitting at the far end of the table, his hand trembling as he reached for his wine.
The dining room was empty now, except for the man I had called my brother for 35 years. I watched Felix reach for his glass, his hand shaking so hard the crystal clattered against his teeth. The wine he was drinking cost $800 a bottle, but I knew that to him it tasted like ash and old regrets. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the penthouse feeling cleaner now that the rats had been cleared out. I didn't look at my sister or my mother. I gestured for them to leave the room. They went without a word, the sound of their footsteps fading into the shadows of the hallway. It was just me and Felix. The man who stood as best man at my wedding. The man who held my son at his baptism. The man who had been helping my wife and son bleed me dry. I spent 40 years building a name you thought you could drag through the mud. I pulled the third ledger from the manila envelope. This one wasn't a copy. It was the original, the private investment book from our shared venture in the Hudson Yards project. I pushed it across the table. It slid over the white linen, stopping right in front of his plate. I was checking the books, Felix, not just the family trust. I was doing a full verification of our joint holdings. I found the offshore shell company you set up in the Caymans. Red Rose Investments, a poetic name for a dirty secret. Felix finally looked up. His face was gray, the skin sagging under the weight of the New York night. Arthur, Claire was desperate. She said you were getting cold, distant. I was just trying to manage the situation. Manage? I asked, my voice as flat as a heart monitor in a morgue. You weren't managing, you were skimming. 8% off the top of every dividend for 3 years. You used my son's legal signature to authorize the transfers, thinking I'd never sue my own blood. You didn't just betray our friendship, Felix. You turned my son into a criminal to cover your own greed. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, the heat of the liquid the only thing keeping the room from freezing over. The smell of the roasting meat from dinner had turned cold and greasy. It was the smell of a dead empire. This isn't a negotiation. It's a cleanup. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and a heavy fountain pen. The gold nib caught the light of the chandelier. As of 6 p.m. tonight, the Board of Directors Advancing Global has been notified of your irregularities. They voted to remove you from the chair effective immediately. Your shares in the Hudson Project? I've already exercised the buyback clause triggered by your breach of fiduciary duty. You're getting 10 cents on the dollar.
Felix's breath hitched. He reached for the pen, his fingers fumbling. You're destroying me, Arthur. I have nothing else. My house in the Hamptons is leveraged against those shares. I know, I said. I already bought the mortgage from the bank. You'll have 48 hours to pack your bags before the locks are changed. Consider this your final notice. The locks are changed, the accounts are frozen, and you're done. The sound of a pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. It was a dry, rasping sound, the sound of a 35-year friendship being erased in 5 seconds. Felix signed the transfer of rights, the ink black and final. He pushed the paper back to me, his eyes dead. I'm not angry, Felix. I'm just correcting a very expensive mistake. I stood up. I didn't offer him a hand. I didn't offer him a goodbye. I watched him walk toward the door, his shoulders hunched, his steps heavy and slow on the marble floor. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. When the front door of the penthouse finally clicked shut, the silence that rushed in was absolute. I walked back to the window, looking out at the city I had conquered. The lights of Manhattan didn't look like eyes anymore. They just looked like lights. I picked up the crystal decanter and walked to the kitchen. I poured the rest of the bourbon down the sink, watching the amber liquid swirl and vanish. I didn't need the drink anymore. I had the truth. I walked through the quiet rooms of my empire. The guests were gone, the traders were gone, the noise was gone. I stopped at the heavy oak door of my study and stepped inside. I closed the door, and the click of the lock was the final word of the night. I sat at my desk in the dark, the scent of old paper and cold New York air surrounding me. My legacy was intact. My name was clean. And for the first time in 31 years, the house was finally quiet.